somebody, you weren't there when the Lord forgave me. Tell them again, you weren't there. You don't know what I was, but the Lord forgave me. You know this to be forgiven by the Lord. Come on, put your hands together and bless the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, who forgives us all of our sins. Amen. On this morning, on this first Sunday of Lent, as we gather together, and I want to thank Dr. Reeves on this Wednesday. She started us off, as some of us were at the joint service for Ash Wednesday, and she started us off about prayer, giving us the battle plan for how we can make it through these 40 days. And I encourage you, they invented the DVR, so you can record your shows and be here on Wednesday night. I encourage you that you take advantage of these learning opportunities as we grow together and journey through this season. As we know, this world is not an easy place. You can't make it by yourself. So we need to know how to equip ourselves properly. And so on this morning, as was read earlier in your hearing, out of the book of Romans, that 5th chapter, that 12 through the 19th verses, allow me just for a moment to read the 18th and the 19th. Therefore, just as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. For just as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. Just for the next few minutes, I want to talk to you about life between the two trees. Life between the two trees. My sisters and brothers, we live in a world in which existing means we go between the polarities, which polarity means the state of having two opposite or contradictory tendencies, opinions, or aspects of indifference that draws our allegiance in two directions, one toward pride and the other towards humility. We're drawn to pride, which is a feeling or deep pleasure or satisfaction derived from one's own accomplishments. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with feeling a sense of pride at the accomplishment of one's achievements, because we are all built upon a legacy of people who were the first in many natural accomplishments in the areas of music and literature, education, and the like. A people should feel pride in their accomplishments, but when we forget the endeavors and what it took to get us there, it can become problematic because our ego takes us to places of self-centeredness and a disregard for the feeling of others. Why, on just this Sunday morning, in the state of Alabama and across this nation, communities of color recognize Bloody Sunday, in which hundreds marched across the Edwin Pettus Bridge one day, being victimized and abused by the very law enforcement agents that were supposed to protect and defend. And yet, even in all of that, they regrouped, got themselves together, and went back again. That's why we cannot think that it is all about ourselves in this woke Me Too era, but somebody paved the way. And so we cannot forget, we cannot give ourselves over to a false sense of pride to think that we made it by ourselves. Hence the expression, pride comes before the fall. And it draws us to the idea of the humans of Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, in which it says that the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and there was the delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. So she took of its fruit, ate it, and she also gave it to her husband who was with her, and he also ate. In this regard, humanity, which was charged with staying away from the responsibility that it was not yet ready for, took a step in the direction of pride, seeking to be equal with the Creator who made all things possible, and seeking to achieve something outside the will and the desire of their Creator. In essence, the desire to an existence void of the intrusion of the Creator and the solitary settlement of one's own accomplishments. If you do this, you will be great. If you go in this direction, you won't need anybody else. It's in this that we live in an existence that, because we are drawn to our own ideas of who we are and what we are outside of God's making and shaping and molding, our pride enters in, leading us down a road of apathy to the needs of the marginalized, because they intrude on our existence and our happiness. We eat of the tree of pride because we want to escape the responsibility to do according to the call of Jesus, which is to be a servant. Our pride gets us into trouble because we serve our own indulgences, needs, and wants. It's pride which can lead us to conceit and the lack of empathy, like we see in our world today, from the White House to the state houses, that wrestle with the lives of people for their own ends and accomplishments. But today, Paul instructs the emerging church to be mindful of the fall and rising that can happen as we wrestle with the polarities that draw our allegiance as we try to model Jesus Christ. It is in this that we stand between the nature of the two trees. It's in this opening of this passage that Paul reminds them that the manner of sin that came into the world, when he says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. It is the sin of pride that move like a virus through our DNA and transcends from one generation to the other. The acts of pride that led to disobedience, which is the end of the polarity that draws us toward the nature of sin, where Paul says, when I try to do right, evil is always there. It's this polarity that was based upon the actions of Israel and her scriptures, where they believed that the ultimate cause of sin in the world was the desire to leave the Lord out, which leads us to a hereditary disease that infiltrates the lives of all creation. Sin, an action or offense that could lead one down a path toward death, is ingrained in us because of the actions of one man who decided that God would be on the outside and he would have a knowledge and understanding that he was not yet ready to handle. He ate of the tree of life when they were told not to touch it, not to eat from it, not to go near it. Yet he and what God had created and gave him got together and did the unthinkable thing because of pride. And on this morning, that pride, which opened up the way of their understanding that they were not prepared for the responsibility for it. It was an uncovering of what would be considered good and what would be considered evil. That this tree would contain not just how to choose life, but how to also choose death, which in itself is a heavy burden. It's a heavy burden to know and decide who lives and who dies. Therefore, the right to life and the right to choose is beyond an understanding of what one thinks is right and what one thinks is wrong. It's a heavy burden to consider a trimester and also to consider a penalty of death, the same way as it's a hidden and heavy burden to consider the number of children that go to bed hungry every night, the number of uninsured and underpaid in America. It's a heavy burden to bear. Because we're able in that moment to decide who lives and who dies. The same way one has to bear the responsibility of who and when to go to war, as there's also to bear the burden of poverty that impacts the lives of millions of America's working poor. When one has to choose, they cannot let pride or envy or jealousy get in the way. If I can stand in front of Mr. Trump, who bears the burden and one that he takes too lightly, when he's drawn to the polarity of pride that leads to destruction for the lives of millions. It's pride that has led us down this road where we cut a budget that cut out millions of people who were on the rolls of food stamps, who needed them to get by. It was pride that cut the lives of those with conditions that they needed medication for, but allowed the drug companies to be able to charge insurmountable numbers for prescription drugs, while all the while a bill sits on Mitch McConnell's desk. It's pride that keeps a House or a Senate engaged in foolishness, not hearing the cries of their people. It's pride that is killing our babies. But Paul reminds them that this is what has exercised dominion over the lives of God's creation. That it was the Lord who had to intervene, giving the law as this tree drew people to it from Adam to Moses, he says. Different transgressions, but no direction. Therefore, Adam was the prototype of what was to come. It was God, through God's intervention, that made possible the work through another tree. Another tree to free us from the bondage that caused us to be drawn over and over again to the actions of the first tree. But God gave us another tree that is central to our text today, which answers the relevant question of what happens when we live our lives between two trees. You see, my brothers and my sisters, death exercised dominion through the actions of one. Therefore, through the actions of another, by God's free gift, we now live another life. Paul says it this way, and I'm going to paraphrase. He says, because sin came through one person, it makes logical sense for God, through God's own action, to make us right, that God would eradicate sin by another. That Jesus is the new Adam, the first of a new creation. One who subdued the powers of sin and death through the act of another tree of humility. That it was Jesus, a modest or low servant, who took on this form. It's Jesus who runs contrary to the actions of the first offense as the redemption vessel for the intervention that leads to life. In this action, he became the image of what the first could not do, because he humbled himself to draw us to another tree. It's in this that he put on the image and the form of a servant that drew God's people in order for us to know that there was life on this side. He drew us to the tree called the cross, where he hung and he bled and he died for our redemption, because God knew what we needed. When we tried to live a life between the two trees, drawn to the other tree of pride and envy and jealousy and malice and guile, it was God, through God's own intervention, that drew us to another tree called the cross, where Jesus hung for our redemption. Another tree called the cross, where God's servant, who looked past our faults, saw our needs, and gave himself. A tree called the cross, one made of humility and love, that we would be saved from our sins. A tree called the cross, where the best would die for us. A tree called the cross, where God's unmerited favor would be poured out on us. A tree called the cross, where God would draw us all to a tree called the cross. That's why, my brothers and my sisters, as we try to live between two trees, I'm glad this morning that God chose the tree for us. For if we would have chosen on our own, we would have chosen the tree of pride and envy. If we would have chosen on our own, we would have chosen the tree of racism and economic injustice. But because God loved us so much, God chose a tree that he would take our place on. That's why the hymn writer said, on a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. God chose that tree called the cross for you and for me, in order that we might have a right to new life. That's why I'm glad this morning I'll cling to that old rugged cross. Till the day Miss Helen my trophies I lay down, I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it one day for a crown. I'm glad this morning I don't have to live between two trees no chose the tree for me. That tree called the cross. Where early on a Sunday morning, the power that prevailed was the love of the cross. On a Sunday morning, the power that lingers is the spirit of God's love on the cross. He said, I could have called 10,000 angels, but for you, I suffered, so you don't have to live between two trees. You don't have to choose no more, because he took your place. And I'm glad today that the tree of life, whose name is Jesus, is where we live and we journey with him. Come on, put your hands together and bless him. Let us stand, my brothers and my sisters.